Good morning, everybody from sunny Toronto. I think the last time we had a session in this series, Making and Remaking Central Europe with a focus on Czechoslovakia, we had wonderful weather. For those of you who are not in Toronto, I like to give a little update. Again, we're experiencing extremely warm temperatures here. And in terms of a COVID update for our friends elsewhere in Canada and maybe overseas, we're in what we call modified stage 2, which looks a lot like stage 2. And there's talk of us exiting that. So that's a quick COVID update. Before I turn the Zoom zone over to my dear friend, Professor Barbara Falk from RMC, I just want to say a couple of things. This, as I said, is second in our series. We started this, I've been working closely with Georgina Steinsky and other supporters that we like to keep a focus on things Czech and more broadly Central European throughout the year, especially in times like this when we need to stay connected, when COVID has done so much to disconnect us. So 2 weeks ago, we hosted an amazing discussion, also moderated by Professor Barbara Falk with Jiří Číban, which was super enlightening, and Jiří was wonderful. And then in my discussions with Barbara and Georgina, we thought, because the Czech Republic has a new Consul General here, Dr. Petr Buriánek, and you'll hear more about him from Barbara, we thought, let's have a great conversation with the Consul General, because he's not just the Consul General, he's a professional historian, and he also has a long association with the late Czech and Czechoslovak President Václav Havel. So that's the event for today. And again, that's going to be chaired by Barbara Falk. I'll come in at the end, everybody. Probably around 11:15, 11:20, Barbara will turn it over to me just to remind you that we have a couple more events in this. We've already scheduled 2 that are co-sponsored, by the way. I need to put in a plug here for a dear friend with the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. And as many of you know, we have this amazingly dynamic instructor in Czech language literature, actually in all things Czech, culture, etc., Anna Petrov. So she's working with me to deliver the second part of the series, which comes to us in January and February of 2021. Okay, so that said, I'm looking forward to this discussion. Dr. Buriánek, I extend you a warm welcome to Toronto. We are long overdue for our lunch, and hopefully we'll be doing that soon. And I look forward to seeing you. Over to you, Barbara.
Thanks very much, Rob, and welcome everybody. I'm very excited to be doing this, participating in this second in a series of events sponsored by the series at CERES at the Munk School. And it is an absolute delight to be able to moderate a conversation with Dr. Petr Buriánek. We spoke a few weeks ago just to lay out how things were going to roll today. And I have to say, having heard about his career and read about his life and looked at his CV, I'm a little envious of his career. And you'll see why when I touch on some points of introduction. Obviously, you all know this already. He's currently Consul General of the Czech Republic in Toronto. He has a doctorate in history from Charles University in Prague, and a very distinguished diplomatic career, having served with the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs in several ambassadorial roles. And he seems to, be very lucky with where he ends up serving: Croatia, Italy, Malta, as well as holding regional advisory portfolios within Prague's ministry offices. But of intense interest to me as a Havel scholar, and perhaps to all of you who are perhaps also interested in the life and work of former playwright, philosopher king, President Václav Havel, prior to the world of entering diplomacy, he served in the office of the President of the Czech Republic as advisor to Havel from 1994 to 2002. And those of you that know your history will know that those were very tumultuous years, shortly after the Czech-Slovak Velvet Divorce, through to being admitted at the beginning of that into NATO, towards the end of that into the European Union. And there was some, interesting debates with sitting politicians and prime ministers at the time that are somewhat famous. And I'm sure that Dr. Buriánek had a bit of a ringside seat too. So how we're going to begin the conversation today is I'm going to give some time to Dr. Buriánek at the beginning to sort of talk a little bit generally about his work and introduce us to his reflections and ideas. And then I'm going to sort of steer our conversation in 4 general areas. And I'll just let you know what those are so you know what's coming. We're going to talk about civil society and the importance of civil society in terms of not only the transition from communism, but also the health of democratic governance and democratic polities. That's not just a transition from state socialism challenge, as we can see elsewhere in the world. It's very much an ongoing democratic challenge. I want to talk a little bit about contemporary values in not only Czechia and Slovakia, but really the Visegrad states more broadly, and how values that Havel held and wrote about still resonate today. Havel on social movements and civil society. Those of you that have been watching Czech and Slovak politics, you'll know that there's been very active civil society movements in Slovakia after the death of the two journalists, and of course, a couple of years ago now, and in Czechia more recently, the gathering steam of the Million Moments movement, and now potentially a transition from that organization into more sort of mainstream electoral politics. And movement politics was very close and dear to Havel's heart, so I'll be pressing Dr. Buriánek on that a bit. And then finally, how we might look at Havel's legacy today. And I have some questions for the Consul General on that. So without any further delay, Dr. Buriánek, I'll pass it over to you for some opening remarks.
Good morning. Hello, everybody. It's my really big pleasure to attend this this series of the talks about the Central Europe, about the politics, about the thoughts of Václav Havel as well. I would like very much thank Barbara for introducing me. It's for me now to arrive to Toronto under such conditions, circumstances of COVID. It was not very easy, but I have to say that now it's much easier for me because I had already occasion to meet many people from the Czech community, from the university circles, if not personally, so online. So it makes, of course, things much easier for me. As Barbara mentioned already, I served particularly in Europe as the ambassador, and I was focused particularly to the European agenda when I was working at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But it doesn't mean that I was I'm not as familiar with the other parts of the world. And that's, of course, particularly because of the fact that I had the occasion to work for President Havel in the 90s and the beginning of 2000 during his two terms, him being the president of the Czech Republic. It's hardly to believe that last year we celebrated already 30 years from the Velvet Revolution, then Czechoslovakia. It means more than 30 years of the changes in the Central and Eastern Europe when the communist regime came to the collapse, and the freedom and the options to form the new democracy, restore the democracy in our countries came. You know, this 40 years of communist regime was really devastating for all the countries. I mean, devastating not only in the economic terms, but for the whole society, for the human lives, for the traditional institutions, for the moral, for the ethics in these countries. And to restore something new was not very easy. And I think that we can testimony this also today. So it means after 30 years of the freedom in our part of the Europe. And we will speak today mostly about the civil society, which of course was one of the most important topic of Havel's agenda. And I'd just like to remind that the civil society was one of the targets, one of the goals of the communist regime to control the state and society in Czechoslovakia immediately after the communist coup in February 1948. All associations, societies, fellowships were put immediately under control. Some of them were prohibited. Many of the representatives of the civil society were put in the prison and under investigation, etc. So communists knew very well what was important for them to control the power, to control the society. So to destroy civil society, and I have to say that in Czechoslovakia, particularly in the western part of the country, civil society was quite well developed. There were so many activities, so many societies, so many associations, and it was not just because of the existence of the Czechoslovakia Republic between two wars, but also because of the development era. I mean, in the second half of the 19th century, the Czech nation was trying to achieve self-determination and lately state independence, and the social society played a very important role in this. Václav Havel was born in the 30s, in the 1936, and he came from the very well-known and respected family in Prague, and I think that also it has some kind of the influence on him, how important civil society can be, because his parents were part of the civil society and the many associations, larger family as well, and I think it helps very much to form his attitude and his ideas about importance of civil society as well. Just shortly to remind Havel, he in the 70s and 80s, after the end of so-called Prague Spring, he was gradually becoming the leader of the Czech dissent, of the Czech opposition. He was one of the founders of Charter 77 and former opposition movement. He was imprisoned because of his opposition activities, and he stayed in the prison for more than 4 years. And I have to say also under very difficult conditions. He was already mentioned playwright, writer, essayist, and in the 70s, 80s, he wrote many important essays. One of the most famous is, of course, The Power of the Powerless, which Barbara knows very well, and she wrote on studies on this. And I think this, I mentioned that because it still has, his essays still have the visible impact in many countries which are still looking for or waiting for the full freedom. I meaning Belarus, for example, Cuba, China, Hong Kong as well. So his political essays, which he wrote in the 80s and 70s, have still visible impact in today's life in many movements in many countries around the world. He became the president 6 weeks after the changes, the end of the 1989. Paradoxically, he was elected by the communist controlled parliament. But he was already quite well known, not only in the Czechoslovakia and the Central Europe, but also because of his previous activities in Western Europe and in US or North America and Canada as well. But I think that he started his political career as the president. He was becoming more and more influential general. He was trying to maintain his own independence. He was always trying not to be seen and not to work as a very typical politician. He was trying to bring to the politics morality, ethics, sense of responsibility, and it means the ideas he was living in his previous life as the writer, as the leader of the opposition movement in the Czechoslovakia. I think there are some points, some key points he was trying to bring to and to represent in his political life. First, of course, it was the human rights issue. He was trying to defend and to speak about the human rights all over the world, no exceptions. The second, already mentioned, civil society. For him, civil society was not only to participate on the life on some associations, but for him generally it was the principle for the state, and for him it was also something what is very natural for the human being. The third point I would like to mention is individual responsibility, generally for oneself, but for the whole world. Something what I think is extremely important and has been mentioned in many of his speeches around the world, but also, of course, in the Czech Republic, that the men and women should be responsible for everything what is developing around themselves, not only in the family, in the society, in its own country, but around the world. I know it's very difficult and it's very theoretical, but he was trying to convince the people that what's going on, what's happening, I don't know, in Hong Kong today or in Belarus, that's something what is the part of my responsibility as well. Of course, the rule of law, the point which for him was always very important principle of parliamentary democracy as well. As I already mentioned, the creation of civil society was one of the most important point for him when after the changes. So because the communists really destroyed the communist society during this 40 years of the period of their regime, he knew very well that to build it, to restore it, will take a lot of time, and that there should be created new conditions, legal and others, from the side of the state. But of course, there will be particularly need the will and the activity of the own citizens. And he focused on this task, especially after the split of then Czechoslovakia in 1992, and when the Czech Republic and Slovak Republic were established at the beginning of 1993. He was elected the president of the Czech Republic, and he knew very well that what's crucial for the new country, for the new state of the Czech Republic, that's to find, to give it some kind of the vision of identity, of the sense. Of course, we have to remind that for many Czechs, it was not easy. I mean, to focus to see the Czechoslovakia to be divided. We lived together for 70 years, and I was born 63, and I could not imagine that the vision of my country I was born in. But it was the fact, and we had to live it. And he knew very well, because he was able to watch in the future. He was very well aware of the fact that the new state need new identity, new vision, and for him it was the civic principle. And again, I would like to remind the time, the beginning of 90s, there was the war on Balkan, and there was the split, the spread of nationalism everywhere in Balkans, but also in many places, in many countries, the former ex-Soviet Union. So again, very fragile, and the situation in the Central and particularly Eastern Europe and Balkan was very tough, very difficult. And honestly, the Western countries were still not very clear about how they will work, let's say, with us. So the Czech Republic or neither Poland or Hungary were the part of the security institutions. We joined NATO only in 1999. We joined EU 2004. So I think that it was very important to think about the future of the Czech Republic, also in this respect, about its identity. And as I mentioned, Havel was advocated for the civic principle, because according to him, the civic principle is the principle that unites and not divides the people.
Dr. Buriánek, I'm wondering if you could wrap up some of your initial remarks so that we can engage in a bit more of a back and forth, and maybe also towards the end invite some comments from the people who are attending. Okay?
Okay, no problem.
Great. Thank you for that excellent introduction. I've made a few notes, and I think you've covered so much of the important questions that Havel both wrote about and effectively exhibited through his lived experience as a playwright, as a dissident, as a president, as a philosopher. You talked about the importance of civil society and connected that to responsibility. I can share with you, and as I could share with the audience today, that there's kind of a trinity of concepts in Havelian thought, if you were, as it were. There's the concept of power, the concept of truth, his famous exhortation for people to live in truth, which he discussed at length in the essay, The Power of the Powerless. And I think Dr. Buriánek and I both share a commitment to looking further at that third element of the Havelian trinity, which is the concept of responsibility. And I think that really shone through his many years in office, where he very much tried to live a kind of an authentic and sincere life as a politician. It didn't always stand him well in terms of local popularity. In fact, he was quite often, panned and ridiculed in the media and among the population at home, but he seemed to continue with it. But I also note how you discussed that this concept of responsibility was really nurtured in and through civil society. And just to further enlighten the group here today, because you mentioned this as well, there was really no independent, not state-controlled civil society in communist era Czechoslovakia. All of the organizations of social life were effectively these Leninist transmission belt organizations. But he really participated with many of his colleagues in creating what came to be known as independent civil society. Václav Benda called it the parallel polis, with a nod to ancient Greek thinking. The idea of this independent space that was outside the purview of the state socialist universe. And within that universe, he wanted everybody to live in truth and to take responsibility for their personal actions to the extent that they could. Now, one of the critiques of Havel, and it would be interesting for you to address this, is, he didn't, he, on the one hand, he drew a thick line with the past when he came into office, and he didn't want to punish, former president or former politicians or even security officers for their misdeeds in the past. So he's sort of pretty generous on the forgiveness side. But on the other hand, he was very demanding of his, compatriots in perhaps demanding a higher moral standard than they were perhaps willing to take up. I mean, it seems there's a criticism of Havel that, living in truth and taking that level of responsibility in any kind of authoritarian regime, whether today it's, China or, Belarus or communist era Czechoslovakia, that's a tall order. And it requires a certain amount of sacrifice and risk. People said, Havel could do that because, he was a little bit wealthier than most. He had royalties from his plays, from overseas hard currency. He and Olga didn't have children, so they'd have to worry about being punished for their kids not going to university, that kind of thing. So I'd just like to comment on the one hand, the more gentler criticism of his, post-communist critics, and the stronger exhortation in communist times. What were your thoughts on that? Or did you ever have those kinds of discussions with the president when you worked with him?
Look, I think that, of course, as I said, for him, when he took the post of the president and he became, and particularly when he was the president of Czechoslovakia, and in this time, the president of Czechoslovakia constitutional has very, very strong power. So he played very important, I think, the crucial role also, of course, inside the Czechoslovakia, etc. He was trying, of course, to do that the same, and he was the president of Czech Republic, but his constitutional power was limited. And I think that he was trying to do his best. If he was criticized that he can do that and that because he is independent, he has no family, etc., etc. It's not true, because he was put in the prison when he was in the 80s and 70s, when he was representing the opposition in Charter 77, and as I said, under very, very, very tough, very difficult conditions. But when he was, of course, he was criticized by many then politicians of in the Czech Republic for many reasons. He was not hard enough meeting the communists. But according to him, it was important for the whole society and for this future, the reconciliation. So it doesn't mean to pardon the communists, but to follow the rule of the law and to follow the existing legislation. And it was up to politicians of the parliament to decide if they want to change the legislation and to put, let's say, the communist leader under the law, under the law. Of course, he was exceptional because he was not dependent on any political parties, crucial political parties in the Czech Republic. He was trying, of course, and he was doing it, to coordinate himself and his ideas with the government, with the main political parties, etc. But he was trying also to influence them, so to explain them how he sees the issues, the topics, and what is important to do. And I think that again, he was trying, I think, to do his best. Of course, sometimes it was for him difficult to convince the politicians, but I think that what was more important, that many of his ideas went to the society, to the whole society, and to I would say genetic of the society.
Can we probe that a little bit further? Because I want to really pick your brain about how you think, you know, Havel's legacies, his moral authority, his ideas still resonate and percolate through society. And I'm thinking not just in terms of Czechia and Slovakia, but perhaps more regionally or globally as well.
I think his ideas are still very much living in the Czech society, and not only there, I think in the Central Europe as well, and particularly, and what's interesting and what's important, among the young generation, among the young people, particularly among those people, the young people who were born after the changes in the 90s, the millennials, etc. And I think that one of the reason is that those people, those young people, they are looking for some visions, for some ideals, for some let's say heroes and leaders, and Havel, they see Havel as
provides that.
very untypical to compare the politician they can see every day in television, in media, and etc. Because he is different, he is unique, and he's speaking about something what seems to be for them important.
How is Havel being taught or appreciated today? Like, can you read the memorandum in a high school English class? You know, are his speeches being taught in a history course in gymnasium? I mean, how is that? Because I know that in the first decades after, you know, the transition, you know, it's really the old textbooks prevailed for a long time. You know, educational curriculum lagged behind the very many pressing changes and reforms that had to occur. And I'm just wondering now, you know, we're 3 decades out, you know, and a good chunk of time since Havel passed away. How do, if he's a beacon to young people, how are they finding out about him?
I think there are more options for young people to find Havel, to find his thoughts, his ideas. I think the most important institution is the library of the Václav Havel, which was founded following the examples which we know in United States. It's actually headed now by Michael Zantovsky, his former close colleague and ambassador to the United States, UK.
Just to pipe in there, I just want to clarify to everybody who may not know who Michael Zantovsky is. He's Havel's most recent and probably most thorough biographer. And the library that Petr Buriánek is referring to is the online Václav Havel library, which is searchable in English and Czech, and it's a phenomenal resource. So for those of you that are graduate students in the series program, make sure you avail yourself of that. So that's a plug for the library.
Exactly. As you said, of course, Michael, he was very close to Václav Havel. He was his first spokesperson, etc. And the library is extremely important source of information, firstly, but secondly, they are organizing almost every day some events, some discussions focused particularly on Havel, but on the topics which are important to Havel, on the, let's say, the foreign policy, human rights issues, the situation in Belarus, etc. And inviting many interesting guests from abroad. So I think that's the first. The second, there are many other associations, for example, the memory, which is trying to document the time of the communism and the memories of the people who lived in the communist regime and opposed or were imprisoned by communists, or on the other hand, the representatives of the communist regime. And they are organizing, together with, for example, foundation people in need, they are organizing many discussions also in the schools, in the colleges, etc. They are doing this online. So I think the young people have really the good chance to find him, to find Havel, to find what he was doing, what he was thinking, and to watch the context of what's going on today in the Czech Republic, in the Central Europe, around the world. I think it's extremely important because now we are living in the world which I think Havel would hardly imagine.
Well, I
Not
certainly,
only because of COVID, but because of many, let's say,
yeah, I think there's a
political
reason why.
events which happen everywhere.
Unfortunately, there are manifold and multiple reasons why I keep reaching for my copy of Open Letters and rereading Havel's essays, because sometimes they seem just as relevant now as when they were written, many in the early to mid 1970s before the formation of Charter 77. I'm interested in how Havel has been memorialized and how his legacy resonates within popular culture. So on the memorialization side, I couldn't help noticing when I flew into Czechia last December that, the airport there, the old Ruzhny airport is now called the Václav Havel International Airport. I went to a number of museums. It was, it was 30th anniversary stuff, I realized, but not just in Prague and, in Olomouc and Bratislava and elsewhere, exhibitions in which not only was the former president portrayed, but in a very positive, almost heroic, one might even say, representations that were akin to the old socialist realism, the photos taken from below, looking above at Havel standing above the crowd. I mean, it made me think of, the portraits of Lenin at the Smolny Institute, is a similar kind of aesthetic. So you have that side of thing. One of our attendees today just put in a question about the recent film about his life. How is that being perceived in popular culture? Are there streets and statues being named after him? Is there going to be a kind of cult of personality, for want of a better term, about Havel in the same way that we saw with respect to Masaryk and the First Republic?
Right. You mentioned Masaryk. I think it's a very good point, because I think that Havel is becoming something like Masaryk. It means for the Czech people, maybe not only for them, more a symbol of the democracy and he is seen together with Masaryk as the most important personality in the modern Czech and Czechoslovak history. You mentioned the airport Václav Havel. I think it's something what really resonates and what is for the, let's say, picture of the country very important, and which was received by the Czech people in a very positive way. On the other hand, I think he would not be very happy to see statues or so many places named by him. So it happens time to time, but not very often, and I think it's not the way he would prefer to go. On the other hand, we can see also, particularly in Poland, which was always very close to Havel, and he had very good relations with many Poles. That there are the initiatives naming the streets and places to him in Wrocław, Warsaw, etc. I think there are some other perceptions, maybe in the way Havel would appreciate that, and it's something which is called Havel's bench, which is let's say, I would use, if you allow me, the quotation made by Tomáš Halík, the close friend of Václav Havel, and he said, the bench with the two chairs actually symbolize the willingness to sit at one table and talk together. And I think that Václav Havel's message is also important. Even though we are people of different opinions, different political beliefs, different religious beliefs, it is still very important that we sit at the same table and talk together and seek the truth together. So this bench, it's there are two very simple, let's say, public art made by a close friend of Václav Havel, Bořek Šípek, the architect and designer. Two chairs connected, and two chairs people can sit and to talk. And this memorial site is has been already installed on many places around the world. I would say there are now more than 50, maybe 100 places, particularly, of course, in the Czech Republic, but many in Germany, France, US, UK, Italy, and Poland, etc. So it's something, again, it's some kind of the civil society activity, because the people should come together with this idea, collect money to install. And so it needs some kind of the work, some kind of the willingness to do something. And we can witness this as I mentioned, in many places around the world. The other thing which is still existing and was found by Václav Havel himself, that's the Conference Forum 2000. Conference Forum 2000, which started in 1997 and was established Havel and his friend Elie Wiesel. So huge conference organized at the Prague Castle during Havel's presidency. And the aim, the topic was to bring important and famous people, some of them the Nobel Prize holders and winners, to bring them together and to discuss from the different perspectives and different disciplines important topics of the whole world. I mean the climate changes, human rights, economic development, the differences between North, South, etc. And this conference is still existing. It's working. It happens every year in Prague, but now more, let's say, in smaller concept, more divided to the smaller discussions, etc. So that's the other, let's say, heritage of still existing of Václav Havel. And I think, sorry.
The way you're describing the Havel's Bench initiative, it reminds me a little bit as a kind of a grand decentralized art project to the Stolpersteine. You know, the stones that are put in front of houses to indicate where people who perished during the Holocaust lived. You know, that was started by, German artist Gunter Demnig many years ago, but it's the same idea of community engagement, decentralization, and a sort of a trans-European type of phenomenon, which is very much in keeping with Havel's views of the world. Absolutely. And Forum 2000, I mean, that's ongoing and it's critical, and it's interesting that those initiatives continue. And if you were to look at, go ahead.
No, I because you were speaking about the Central Europe and maybe not to concentrate, to focus only on the Czech Republic. But I would like, you mentioned it already, to pick up Slovakia, and particularly the president of Slovakia, President Čaputová. She was elected half a year ago. Before the election, she was completely unknown to the larger public. And I think that her election, it was the victory, or it was the elections which was extremely supported by the civic society, and he knew that. He appealed to the civic society to work together, to all the citizens, etc. And what's important, and we could witness this during her campaign and when she was elected, that he named Havel and his ideas to be very close to her and to be one of the sources and one of the topics she would like to follow. So she is very clear in that. She was very clear even before being elected. And I think it's a very important, interesting example how Havel's idea and Havel as assemble can live also in the neighboring, very close country of the Czech Republic. And Poland and Hungary, Professor Třibaň spoke about those countries and about the current development there. And I think that if you look at the political discussion there, I think, of course, that his ideas are much closer to the current opposition in those countries. I think it's
Agreed.
not big surprise. It's not big surprise, and because, of course, that's for him always the freedom of media, for example, or independent justice was so important for the democracy and to unite the people and not to divide them. So something what I have the feeling that the current leaders in those countries are not doing very well.
Right. Now, it's one, I mean, you could definitely see the spirit of Havel and his ideas in the October 15th demonstrations in Budapest. The current women's strike happening in Poland is absolutely extraordinary and ongoing. And I think not getting enough Western press because we're fixating too much on the election, which we still don't know the outcome of in the US. But could you elaborate a little further on how young people within Czechia are drawing on Havel's ideas and talk about how his ideas can be translated into more concrete movement style politics, how to impact the political system from both without and within. I'm thinking in particular about the Million Moments marches. And of course, you know, their leader has now tried to kind of transition or is in the process of transitioning into more mainstream politics. How do you see that happening? And what's the end game of that story? Where's that going?
I don't know what will be the end game of this story, but the fact is that the Million Moments for Democracy was, I have to say, quite a surprise for us, for my generation, etc. It's only 2 years ago, it was completely unknown and a very small group of very young people, the students particularly, coming from Prague, but not only from the Prague. And they were trying to remind the people in the Czech Republic their responsibility for the democracy and for the development generally in their own country. And they were fighting, of course, against corruption, against many other issues. But mainly what was interesting that they were addressing the people to be more, as I said, responsible, but to bring their own initiatives, to speak together, to appeal, to make some, let's say, discussions among themselves. And they were able to organize the manifestations. The biggest one was happened on the huge square in Prague, and they were able to bring together 500,000 of the Czech people. Czech Republic has something more than 10 million people, and in Prague live 1 million people. And what was, of course, they were very clear that Havel was for them very positive symbol. They quoted many of his let's say ideas, etc. And I think that I don't know, because of course the COVID has the influence also in this case, and they had to eliminate their activities and even to partly to stop them. And you mentioned that one of the leaders, he decided to join politics and to form the new political movement, because Million Movements for Democracy is trying to be completely a political movement, the social movement. And I don't know how it will end up. I honestly, I have no, I don't think that this political, new political guy will succeed very much, because to play politics is something different that to make this civic movement. But what was important that they were trying to bring the people together, to discuss the different issues, to engage them, to remind them their responsibility, and of course, what's important in the Czech Republic, not stay only in Prague, in the capital, but they had many collaborators and the members in the smaller cities, on the country, etc., trying to do the same there, to bring the people to discuss and to activate them. So maybe they will not succeed, I don't know, but I think that they woke up something what will continue.
Oops, there we go. Sorry, just took me a minute to unpress my mute button. You know, I'm particularly intrigued by this whole tension, I suppose, between parties and movements, and you know, Million Moments, some variation of that group transitioning into a party, because this is a tension, I think, that's inherent in Havel's thought that goes right back to the, you know, the late 80s and the early 90s. You know, he was very much in favor of the idea of, as a president, being above the political fray, of, again, encouraging civic activism at a personal and community level. He didn't really want to get involved in partisan attachments. Some people say he became, you know, irrelevant or lost his touch or became disconnected because he kind of refused to get down and dirty and involved in electoral politics. And it's, you know, that's maybe where the rubber hits the road and where real change has to happen, even though it's messy and nobody likes to see the sausage being made. And are we kind of there again, you know, 3 decades later, where on the one hand, it's great to have all of these worthwhile goals and sit at the table. But on the other hand, you know, to make real change, there's, you know, government is about the authoritative allocation of financial and governmental resources. And in order to effect change, you've got to get in there and make that happen. And I see this in particular with respect to the movement to combat climate change. I mean, it's not just a matter of getting a lot of people in the streets. It's a matter of real concrete changes that have to be made within industry, within government, with targets that are met, and so on. So again, this tension, it's not a specific to Czechia tension, but I think it's a tension that really highlights not only through Havel's writing, but through his own political practice and his own political struggles, if you will.
Havel was always opposing the thesis that if you want to change something, you should join politics. Of course, if you want, you can join politics. You, as this young guy probably is doing, and to try to be part of the political scene. For Havel, there are two parallel issues. politics and the civil society. And they should work together. They should influence themselves. And that's for him the that's for him the principle of the parliamentary democracy. As I said, he was unique. He was not dependent. He was not the part of any political party. Of course, there were parties he was closer, or but he was never dependent on them. And I think it was the part of his policy. I think that you're absolutely right. If there should be any change, there should be the election. There should be somebody who wants changes according to the constitution, etc., etc. But on the results of the elections and how the new parliament in the Czech Republic or elsewhere will look like, or who will be elected the president, it's very much dependent on the civic society as well, and on the ideas, what they are doing, what they are focusing on. I think that they are the issues which are very much connected. And honestly, so now 30 years ago, 30 years after the changes, Havel's ideas and Havel as a symbol is still living. I don't know who from the current politicians will be the, let's say, will be still so important like today maybe is in 10 years, let's say. So that's the difference. And what I said at the beginning, I think that the Havel is already the part of the genetic of the Czech society, as President Havel, as President Masaryk is still, and I think it will not change neither in the future. Of course, he will be accepted only by part of the society, but I think it's normal. But he still can generate a lot of activities and ideas, and maybe even the new politicians, who knows.
Well, you certainly won't find me disagreeing with you on the contemporary relevance of Havel, having spent a good chunk of my adult life devoted to making that case myself. And I was thinking about, as you were talking, that wouldn't it be a wonderful thing to, I don't know, raise money at the University of Toronto, who's listening to me here, to have a Havel's bench in the courtyard of the Munk School. That would be a fitting tribute indeed. Something we have to think about in Canada. New ways of memorializing and keeping Havel's memory and legacies alive. Rob, I'm not sure if you want to punch in at this point and make a few comments. I have a couple more comments I'd like to make, but I'm mindful of the time as well.
Pretty good on time, Barbara. Did you want to, just a couple of comments. I did pursue the Havel bench pretty vigorously, and yeah, that ship sailed, and I'll tell you why another time.
Okay. That sounds like a beer. That sounds like a Czech beer conversation.
It's not as easy as you think to put monuments up on university campuses. And I've also got, it's too long a story, but I wanted to comment on Dr. Buriánek's one other comment that, when you talk about Havel, and like Barbara, I'm not as immersed in it as Barbara, but my students read Havel. I'm constantly reminding them how important Havel was, and how critical it is for them to particularly read Power of the Powerless. Having said that, you are dead right, Consul General, that I cannot think of any politicians who will have that kind of impact 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And just as a personal anecdote, I used to work for the CBC, and when I got my job there, you had to do a test, or actually before I got my job, and they gave you this writing test, which was actually kind of tough. And one of the things they gave me was to write the introduction to Václav Havel's obituary, as it was. And he had not died then. This was the theoretical thing, and Havel was quite well, was in and out of good health, but I found it such a challenge because it was a 3-sentence thing where you would throw to, and now I turn to Barbara Falk live in Prague, right? Do you follow me? So it was at anchors. And I have to say, those were the toughest 3 sentences I ever had to write, to try to capture in a meaningful way the extraordinary impact and how one person was able to bring so much calm in a time that could have delivered so much chaos. I think.
Oh, I feel you, because after Havel passed away, myself and Edith Klein and a few others were contacted by media. Paul Wilson was another within Canada, to give our 3-second sound bites on, what did Havel mean to the world? And it's a very difficult thing to do. But, the fact that we're still having these discussions over and over again, merit that. Somebody in the chat bar said, what were those 3 sentences?
Yeah, I know. That's Joseph Hawker. I'm going to give him a call later. But I'm
okay.
Say, why don't you do some of the questions? You want to take some questions from the audience?
Why don't we take a few questions from students, if you want to, particularly in the series program. We always like to privilege their.
I'm looking at the chat box there. It's hard.
Yeah, there's the chat box. There's the Q&A.
I'm trying not to use names anymore, Barbara, just so I can see.
Okay. Here's a good question. If we look at the concept of the movement of democratic countries to elected autocracies, this sounds like a person that's feeling as depressed as I am today. Do you see that happening in you've got CR here. Do you mean Croatia or Czechia?
Czech Republic.
Czech Republic. CR should be a big R, but anyway, never mind. Do you see a kind of a negative devolution towards autocracy? I mean, there's been a lot of conversation about the sort of presence of kleptocracy and corruption and so on. I don't want to force you to step too far out of your ambassadorial and diplomatic roles, but I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, I think all the countries have the problems, and of course it's corruption. It can be problems with the freedom of the media, justice, etc. But I think that it's not the countries you mentioned, my country and Croatia. It's not so bad. I think that we, again, it's always important to let the people speak and know what they are thinking about, and to politicians to be able to accept these voices. And that's something what I think, for example, in the Czech Republic is doing quite well. And, the oppositions also play its role. I don't know exactly the situation in Croatia, but I think that at least they have also, let's say, 2 pillars at least. The opposition keeps the post of the president. The government is from the other part of the political sphere. So if something wrongs, it should be said. And I think if we have the chance to say it and to let it now, it's still.
I'd like to pick up on your
open way for that the development.
I'd like to pick up on your comment. If something's wrong, it should be said, because it relates exactly to another question that we have in the Q&A, which relates to the neoliberal reforms in the mid-1990s under the leadership of then Václav Klaus. You would have been in Havel's office at that time, so you would have had an insider view to the tension between the two Václavs. And can you talk about that? Was there any kind of sense of betrayal on Havel's part that here was one kind of authoritarian structure being replaced by another? I mean, there was definitely a kind of a fetish going on among the transition economy types about installing their economies into a kind of global neoliberal vision. And Havel was critical of that, but if you can give us a bit of a sense of having been on the inside during that time.
I think I will say no secret that those two personalities were completely different. Different as the politicians, different as the human being. But on the other hand, I have to say that although maybe some of them are not clear in this, they respect each other. Havel respected a lot what Klaus was doing during his, I mean, the presidency of Havel when he was politically engaged. But I think generally for the Czech Republic, it was important to have both types of the personalities. One focused on very practical, economical, let's say, issues. And the second one was more focused on the ideas, on the visions, and on the more connected with the civil society. Civil society was something Klaus definitely didn't like very much, and he thought that is something what is not important and that it's has no part in the political life or the civil life, etc. But he was not, generally, he was not opposing it. If they want, they can live, they can function. It's but it's not important for the country, for us.
Well, Klaus kind of came to politics as a technocrat, and Havel came to politics as part of a movement. I mean, those are two very different trajectories into the political space.
But honestly, Klaus came to the politics as well as the part of the movement. But he realized very quickly what is important to do to be successful real politician. I mean, to make the real politics. But Havel was different. I think this division, prime minister and president, was in some regards optimal for this stage of development in the Czech Republic.
Okay, well, I think we're coming close to an end of things here. I just want to make a couple of shameless self-promotional plugs. I hope Rob forgives me for this. One is that, and Dr. Buriánek already knows, so I'm not just doing it for his benefit, but for the audiences. Myself and a soon-to-be graduating series student, Daniela Bouvier-Valenta, have written a book chapter on Havel's concept of responsibility, which we discussed a lot today. And that is going to be forthcoming in a volume edited by David Danaher and Kieran Williams called Havel's Key Concepts. And it's going to be published in the next year by Carolina in Prague. And we're really hoping that somehow we'll all be vaccinated and there'll be sort of a wonderful book launch somewhere in the heart of the city, and we'll all be able to get there in person. Hopefully that can happen. And also, just so the incoming series students note, if you're looking for a great example of a master's research paper to read, Daniela's paper on the Million Moments March is fantastic. And I know she's blushing right now, but you can't see her. But it's a great paper and a great example of the kind of work being done on contemporary Central European and Czech politics at the University of Toronto right now. Rob, over to you.
Terrific. Yeah, Barbara, you're always welcome to make a plug. You know that, and I really enjoyed that. And as you know, I know Daniela, aka Dashi, very well. And if she's out there, you know, I hope I'm sending her my very best wishes. Terrific student and a terrific paper, and Barbara was a terrific supervisor. The other plug is even though Barbara is at RMC, she also is a good friend of our center. So she happily supervises students. So for the students out there who might be listening today, Barbara is a great choice as a supervisor. She's super engaged and really devoted to the success of not just the students where she teaches, but also the students at the U of T. I thought this morning was really terrific. And Petr, Dr. Buriánek, I really appreciate that you joined us. I'm looking forward to seeing you face to face and not in the Zoom world. And that's coming soon. Barbara, you're a gem like always. I'm wishing you a safe drive. I know you're headed northwest originally. If you're looking for a good snack on the road, I know these roads terribly well. When you go past the turnoff to Elliott Lake on Highway 17, Barbara, there's a little restaurant called Annette's Diner in a small town called Sprague.
Got it.
Stop in there. It's a mother-daughter team, Annette, of course, and her mom, Pauline. They do a terrific. Northern Ontario is known for many things, but I think of Northern Ontario as toasted westerns.
Toasted westerns. Okay.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite breakfast foods. But stop in there and give those nice people my regards, because
I figure my hope for finding a Starbucks is pretty slim.
You're going to have to settle for Tim Hortons, I'm afraid, which is not my thing. But stop in. The Net has pretty bad coffee, but a good toasted western.
Okay,
Petr, Dr. Buriánek, we stay in touch. As I said at the beginning, we have 2 more events, largely organized by our delightful Czech instructor, Anna Petrov, and that's David Koržinek in January of next year. I'll send you the details. And then Peter Stalik in February. But there's lots of time to sort that out. And Barbara and I have already talked. We've got 4 events, but we're going to probably move it up, Barbara, to 5.
Yeah.
Barbara had a good idea. Libora Oates in Drukovac, if I'm correct, who's at the University of Graz, is an old friend of Barbara's, but an old friend of the center. So that's it. Wishing all of you well. It's looking like terrific weekend here in Toronto, you know, and we're in, as I said, modified stage 2. Sorry, these terms make me laugh for some reason. I can't help but smile. I'm headed north where there's no COVID.
Get outside, enjoy the weather while we still have it.
Petr, I'll be in touch, and my regards to all of you, and have a terrific weekend. Barbara, maybe I see you on the highways and byways tomorrow.
Take care, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is
I would like very much to thank all of you for having me there. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great day, everybody. Ciao.